Hey there. Do you like weird stuff? I like weird stuff. Do you like weird stuff? Cool. Let's talk about some weird stuff. Welcome to Alex in Wonderland, where we tumble down the rabbit hole and discover the wonderfully weird and the weirdly wonderful. Let's start by travelling back to Germany in the late 19th century to meet a very clever horse. Der kluge Hans, or in English, Clever Hans, was a horse that had apparently been trained by his owner, Wilhelm von Osten, to perform mathematical tasks. Wilhelm was a high school and mathematics teacher in his native Germany, with a keen interest in psychology and also something of an amateur animal trainer. Wilhelm theorized that animals were far more intelligent than people had given them credit for. Before turning his attention to a horse, he initially tried to teach basic maths to a bear and a cat, with, I assume, mixed results. But it was the Orlov trotter horse named Hans that showed more promise. After a while, the horse Hans learned to use his hoof to tap out a number written on a blackboard. His trainer Wilhelm would write the number 3, and Hans would the correct number. Eventually, Hans was taught to add, subtract, multiply, divide, work with fractions, tell the date and time, and even read and spell simple words. Wilhelm began parading Clever Hans all over Germany, showing off his equine star pupils' mathematical prowess. Large crowds gathered to watch as Hans tapped out answers to questions like, what is the square root of 16? Or tapped out the letters of people's names, 1 tap for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, and so on. Although he was occasionally wrong, Hans was right about 89% of the time, and was said to have the mathematical proficiency of your average 14-year-old human. Naturally, some people were skeptical, the most obvious suspicion being that the trainer was secretly signalling Hans. So, in 1904, an investigation was launched. But it was soon proved that Hans still got top marks even when other people asked the questions. Zoologists, psychologists, horse trainers, school teachers, and even a circus manager all tried to discover if and how Wilhelm von Osten was in fact tricking the public. But none of them could find any trickery, so they all declared Hans to be a very, very clever horse indeed, and of course, so was the man who trained him. Psychologist Oskar Funkst agreed Wilhelm was indeed not a fraud, but he did have an interesting theory that might just explain Hans's clever abilities. He noticed that if the questioner didn't know the answer to the question, Hans suddenly lost his skills. And if the questioner was out of sight of the horse or even stood relatively far away, Hans's accuracy dropped to almost zero. So, Funkst started to observe the humans around Hans rather than Hans himself, or horse self, or itself. He noticed their breathing, posture, and facial expressions involuntarily changed when Hans tapped his hoof. Slowly, the audience and his trainer would become more and more tense as Hans got closer and closer to the correct answer. As soon as Hans had tapped enough times to get to the correct answer, the subtle tension in the audience's body language would disappear, which cued Hans to stop. You see, Hans wasn't a gifted mathematician, he was in fact an intuitive people reader. Hans had inadvertently been trained by Wilhelm to start and stop tapping his hoof in reaction to these subtle, non-verbal cues from his trainer, cues that Wilhelm was completely unaware he was giving, and when Hans couldn't see his trainer, he looked to the gathered crowd to get his cue in order to get his sugar lump. Hans was a clever horse, just not in the way that Wilhelm thought. In fact, Wilhelm never really accepted this explanation and continued to tour his clever horse across Germany for many more years, believing he had taught a horse in the ways of mathematics. This gave rise to the term Clever Hans effect, or sometimes known as the experimenter effect, where the questioner or experimenter is giving cues involuntarily, even if they try and suppress them, which cue the animal to give the correct response. And it's not just horses. The phenomena has been observed in various animals, including sniffer dogs and humans. In fact, once Funkst discovered what was really happening, he proved his theory by putting himself in the role of horse, tapping out his answers to questions whilst carefully observing the body language of the audience around him. And I, for one, really hope he went fully method in getting into the role, eating hay, sleeping in a stable, letting people ride on his back. The Simpsons even based the episode Smart and Smarter on the Clever Hans effect. In the episode, Lisa becomes jealous of Maggie when her baby sister seems to be more intelligent than her. It is eventually revealed that Maggie has been watching Lisa so carefully that she can sense the right answer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the weird and wonderful tale of a very clever German horse called Hans. But Hans was not the only gifted animal. Hans's trainer was proven to be entirely innocent of faking it. Wilhelm von Osten had no idea he was inadvertently cueing his beloved horse with his body language, but some people have used this technique knowingly to deceive the public.